Alright guys, welcome to another video. This is just going to be a quick video to answer some of your questions regarding the E55's engine rebuild, because a lot of you guys asked me about what was the cost of doing the engine rebuild and what were all the parts required and what were all the tools required to do the engine rebuild. So I finally got to putting a list of all the parts required, and I also got to adding up all the bills that I spent on rebuilding my engine, and I've totaled everything. So starting off by the cost, so actually before I even do that, first of all, just starting off by what the dealers quoted me for this engine. So when I blew the engine on my E55, the first thing I did was ask the dealers what would be the price of a new engine, and the dealer said $65,000. So if you were to blow an engine on your E55 and drive into the dealership, that's how much you would pay for a new engine. So that's obviously not even a realistic option, paying $65,000 for an engine on a car that's not even worth a quarter of that amount. So the only realistic option I had was to find a used engine, and that's what I did. So I was able to find a used engine from a 2006 CLS 55 with 188,000 kilometers. And this is the price that I paid for the engine, $2,800, which I thought was a really good deal, and which seemed like a really good deal for an AMG engine. But when I took the engine apart, the engine was actually all filled with oil sludge. All the connecting rod bearings were spun and had the same hard oil o-ring, the same thing that my E55 had, which is why that engine blew. So that obviously wasn't a good thing to take the engine apart and see all that going on inside that engine. So obviously I couldn't have put that engine back together just like that, because once bearings are spun, you can't put an engine, because all the connecting rod bearings, I found them in different positions. They weren't in the position they should be in. So once the bearings are spun, you can't bolt the engine back together just like that and put it in the car and expect it to last, because over time those bearings would wear out, and eventually those bearings would cause the engine to blow up sometime later, and obviously then the engine would be completely beyond repair. I could have still returned that engine at that point, but the reason I decided to keep the engine was knowing that I was going to be using this engine for racing, and I had to make some internal changes to that engine anyways. I decided that I might as well keep that engine, because other than these issues, the cylinder walls were in fairly good shape, the pistons were in fairly good shape, so all those things were fairly okay in this engine. Which, if I were to buy another engine, that was another risk that I would be taking, because you can't tell how the internal condition of the engine is without actually taking the engine apart. Talking about the cost, what I spent on rebuilding this engine, so I've just totaled up all the bills that I spent for buying parts. Most of the parts I did buy from the dealership, but some of the other parts I also bought online, so I've just totaled all the bills together over here. And the total for all the parts came down to $4,700. This doesn't include things like assembly lube or engine oil or other things that I needed along the way to rebuild the engine. If I added all the costs, I think the price would have been somewhere around $5,000. And so the total for the cost of the rebuild and the cost of the engine came to $75,000. Now, for the people watching over in the States, this price might look a little high, because part of the reason is it's in Canadian dollars. Everything is in Canadian dollars, by the way, all these bills, all of that. So if you convert Canadian dollars to US dollars, first of all, the price would come down significantly. And the other thing is that parts are expensive here in Canada. They're not the same prices that they are in the States. And even if I were to buy parts from the States, by the time you paid import duties, currency exchange, and shipping and all that, the parts generally do come to the same price. And the other thing is that everything I replaced on my engine is not necessary that every time you take your engine apart you need to replace all those parts, because the thing is that some of the parts that I replaced, things like the timing chain or the timing chain guides, the second time I take my engine apart, I'm definitely not going to be replacing all that, because that completely depends on the condition of the parts inside the engine. You might not need to replace some of these things that I replaced in my rebuild. And to make more sense of all that, I've put a list together, and I've divided this list into 3 categories. So one-time use parts, these are parts that the service manual says are only one-time use, and you absolutely need to replace these parts every time you take your engine apart. And the second is replace if out of spec. So these are parts that you'll actually need to measure the specifications of these parts and only replace them if they're out of spec. And other parts are things like items that just wear out in general, things like the timing chain and timing chain guides. That obviously completely depends on your engine whether you actually even need to replace these parts or not. And I know I'm still missing a few part numbers, because I couldn't find all the bills for my parts, and some of the parts I still didn't even get to replacing, things like the flex plate to crankshaft bolts. These ones I still haven't ordered or replaced, just because I haven't still gotten to bolting the transmission back on. But yeah, anyways, if you guys do find some missing parts on this list, you can comment that below. And also, if any of you guys want to post this on a forum or something, you can comment it and I can send you this file so you can post it on a forum, because I believe it would be helpful for people knowing all the part numbers and having some type of estimate of the prices that are required to actually like do all this maintenance on the engine. But quickly going over the list for now. So for the one-time use parts, this involves some fasteners that stretch over time and then you can't use them again, and obviously all the gaskets that you can't reuse again, you have to replace them every time. The total comes down to $1,000, or like with the missing prices, at least it would be somewhere close to $1,000. For all the parts. This is just if you're taking your engine apart and bolting everything back together. You will need to spend $1,000 just by replacing all these one-time use parts. Now for the parts that are replaced out of spec, these are parts that with some of them people would need to replace every time. So things like the connecting rod bolts and the head bolts, these are things that most people would want to replace anyways, because even though the service manual says you can use the connecting rod bolts again if they haven't stretched beyond a certain limit, I definitely wouldn't feel safe reusing the connecting rod bolts again, because if something like that breaks in the engine, obviously it will blow your entire engine if the connecting rod bolt fails. So it's something that most people would want to replace these parts anyways, like especially when you're spending $1,000 and doing all that work, taking your entire engine apart. It's probably worth it replacing these parts along as well, to give your engine that extra bit of life so that you don't have to pull your entire engine apart again when, like, let's say something else wears out the next time. These parts, other wear items, these are just items that I've thought of along the way. So some things that I have replaced, like timing chain and timing chain guides, but this is something that will completely depend on your engine. So let's say, to give you an example, for my engine the timing chain guides were cracked, so that's definitely something that does need replacement if they're cracked. But I've also added oil pump on this list. I haven't added a price for that. It's something that I didn't replace, but I've just added it on the list because I've heard from some people recommend that you should be replacing your oil pump anyways every time you do an engine rebuild. I don't think it's necessary to replace your oil pump every time you do an engine rebuild, just because I just think it's more important to take your oil pump apart and just inspect that it doesn't have any damage or it's not worn out. I think the oil pump, generally oil pumps do last a really long time. The only time you will really need to replace your oil pump is that if there is some copper going through the oil pump or some worn metal going through the oil pump that wears the oil pump out or damages the oil pump from inside. In that case, yeah, for sure you'll need to replace your oil pump. So yeah, that's just something to have in mind, but you might not necessarily need to replace. Some other things, this guide wheel and this guide wheel bolt. It's this thing in the diagram. There's a bolt and there's this guide wheel for the timing chain. The only time you will need to replace that is that there's this rubber on this gear, and when this rubber breaks, your timing chain will become noisier. So if that rubber has broken, you might want to replace this guide wheel. Well, these were all the internal things that are inside the engine, and for the external things, I've added them over here. So things like the serpentine belt, supercharger belt, pulleys, spark plugs, that entirely depends on your engine. These are things that you should be inspecting time to time anyways, and if they're worn, you should replace them. So like things like the plastic pulleys, if you don't inspect them and they happen to crack and break, then obviously it's something that you can be stuck on the side of the road because of that. Spark plugs generally need to be changed around 160,000 kilometers for these cars, and also the oil filter and all the fluids, you'll need to change them anyways. There's other things that I should have added on this list, things like air filters, or some people even like replacing their spark plug wires, and yeah, there's definitely other things that can be added on this list. So yeah, if anyone wants to post this on a forum and actually complete this list, like complete all the missing part numbers and all the prices, I think it's definitely something that will be helpful for other people, and it definitely would be helpful for me, because I wouldn't have to come up with the list again next time I go to order parts. Going over some of the tools required to do this engine rebuild, so I guess I'll just start off by the spanners. So some of the bigger spanners you'll need is 17 millimeters and 27 millimeters. 17 millimeter you'll need it for the supercharger belt, and also a few other places there's 17 millimeter used, and 27 millimeters is for the timing chain tensioner, that's 27, and most importantly the camshaft sprockets, they're 27 millimeters. So you'll need a 27 millimeter to hold the sprocket in place while you remove the bolt. And some of the bigger sockets you'll need is 17 millimeters. This one is 1516 is just for this supercharger, for removing the pulley off the supercharger if you need to remove that. Then you'll need 27 millimeter. 27 millimeter is for the crank pulley bolt over there if you want to turn your crank pulley, and there's also a lot of other 27 millimeter bolts used on this engine. You'll need a 46 millimeter bolt. This is only for one hex bolt on the engine. That's for this oil filter housing. To remove the oil filter housing, you will need a 46 millimeter socket. Some other tools you'll need: assembly lube. Go with 2 assembly lubes actually. One assembly lube for the camshafts and one assembly lube for the fasteners. So all the fasteners like the head bolts, connecting rod bolts, you need to put assembly lube on them before torquing them, just to make sure that you get the proper torque on them. You'll need some type of piston ring compressor to compress the piston rings to put them in the block. You definitely need a set of torque sockets. So this one is, let me see what size it is. So this one starts from T15. I believe there was even a smaller one smaller than T15, and it goes up all the way to T60. So yeah, you'll definitely need a socket. T55, this one's a little bent. This one is the one for the head bolts. Head bolts do get torqued extremely tight, so that's why you can see some damage on this one. Make sure to have a good set, or buy at least two, because you might even break some of these along the way, because for those surge tanks on the supercharger, sometimes when you're removing these bolts, sometimes the bits do break. So it's a good idea to have an extra set. For other things, you'll need this tool to remove your spark plugs. This is, the size is 5/8. And other sockets that you'll need along the way, you'll need a set of E-Torques, so one of these. So this one goes all the way up to E20, and this was good for all the sizes on this engine, so I think you're going to be using this an awful lot, by the way. Most of the bolts on this engine are E-Torques. You'll also need one of these Allen sockets, because there is a few Allen sockets on this engine, and yeah, general hex sockets. I don't think there's too many hex, but there are a few used on this engine, so you'll need this one too. For honing the cylinders, you can just use a regular hone and line it up with some felt, and you'll need a special paste for this. It's Sunin AN30, I believe the name for that paste is. You'll also need a set of feeler gauges to measure out some of the values, clearances, or just measuring surfaces. And also you'll need plastic gauge or micrometers, or whichever thing you prefer, to measure the clearances for your crankshaft and connecting rod bearings. And for tightening the bolts, you'll definitely need two torque wrenches, one for low range, so like 4 Newton meters or all the way up to 30 Newton meters. So you'll definitely need that. You'll definitely need a torque wrench for that low end, 3 Newton meters to 30 Newton meters, and then you'll need one of these bigger torque wrenches for all the bigger torque. In Newton meters, it starts from 33 Newton meters and goes all the way up to 345 Newton meters. For the angles, you'll need a torque angle gauge, something like this, so you can actually measure how much angle you're putting on the bolts. Other than that, you'll also need a tool for compressing your valve springs, a valve spring compressor. That's only if you want to remove your valves. Oh, and some other things I might as well mention. Well, I'm not sure if it counts as tools, but you'll need some type of an engine stand to actually like bolt the engine on, so you can do all the work on it. And you'll need some type of crane or an engine picker or whatever you want to call it, just so that you can actually lift the engine up and put it on the engine stand, and also to get it off the engine stand. So yeah, that's everything for this video. I hope it answers all your questions regarding the engine and all the tools required to rebuild it. Also giving you guys a quick update on the next project. So I did end up taking most of the E55 apart. I have the rear subframe over here. There's the drive shaft. That's the front subframe. I was weighing some of the parts, that's why I have it over there. But yeah, after I take all of it apart, the only thing left, by the way, right now is just the electronics. I just got to take the dash apart and take some of the wiring out. But yeah, I think 90% of the work is almost done. I just got to remove some wires now and take that out. And once I get all of that out, I just got to organize the garage, make some space over here, so I can start building the tube frame chassis. I've already measured all the sizes and everything, so I'm just going to leave an order for the steel hopefully sometime this week, later this week. And yeah, once that's done, then hopefully you guys should start seeing some really interesting videos from that project. So yeah, definitely try to stay tuned for that. That's everything for now, and thanks for watching.